Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome, wherever and whenever you are listening to the Race O'Clock podcast. It's been a little while, hasn't it? I will go ahead and explain that straight away. We've been off the air for a few weeks because I got very unwell. I was coughing and spluttering and all these sorts of things. It was a very unpleasant time. You wouldn't have enjoyed listening to me whilst I was like that. Yeah, that's basically it. It sort of came and went. I sort of thought in the second week that, maybe I can record this time. And then, no. Everything was very painful in terms of speaking and all the rest of the things. But no, we're back now. We've had a Chinese Grand Prix. We've had a couple of other Grand Prix in the intervening time as well. But because we, of course, as usual, will be limiting ourselves to just 1 hour of talking, otherwise, we'll end up going on forever and ever and ever. We're just going to focus on the Chinese Grand Prix and the immediate impact of that, the fallout from it, and then looking forward, of course, to Miami, the next Grand Prix. So, we're going to hit the clock now. So, the clock is started now. Chinese Grand Prix then. That's what we're going to be talking about for the majority of today's podcast. Of course, a little bit, as I say, in terms of looking at what's going on going forwards. But Chinese Grand Prix then, I thought was a great event. I thought it was probably race of the season so far for me, even though it did ultimately end in Max Verstappen winning the race and blah, 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 blah. I'm not a Red Bull fan. I'm not a Max fan, as anybody who's been listening to the podcast for any sustained period of time will know. I'm not anti them by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a bit boring when a team that you don't support or a driver that you don't support is constantly winning all of the time. In that sense, in terms of the overall result, that peak of the weekend in terms of who stands on the top step, that was a little bit boring. But I think everything else behind was actually really quite interesting, really quite entertaining. We had, of course, our first sprint of 2024 as well, which was interesting. Which the drivers, of course, had made this point as well. This is a circuit they had not been back to since 2019. So it's a number of years since we've been at the circuit. The circuit's gone through resurfacing, it's gone through other bits and pieces in the meantime as well. The cars have changed massively since 2019 too, in terms of how they generate their performance, how they drive, how they feel, the weight of them, all these various different bits and pieces. And so that then led to one practice session, and that's your lot. You've then got to, of course, get yourself the sprint qualifying done, then the sprint itself, then we go into qualifying and then the Grand Prix. So there is more, I guess, quote-unquote, practice along the way for the drivers to be able to acclimatise to the circuit and so on. But they're doing so in a point or in a period of competition where this now counts for something. This is no longer just a practice session where you'd usually get 3 in a normal Grand Prix weekend. Instead, no, it's very much get in there and get pushing on straight away. So I like that. I like that we limit practice time on the sprint weekends. I'm not necessarily sure if I'm a fan of sprints, generally speaking. I think that the sprints, there could be something far more interesting being done with them from a competitive point of view, from a perhaps young drivers representation point of view. Things like that. That's what sort of I think the sprints could be used for. I think that the Grand Prix should still be the main event of the weekend, should be the main attraction for everybody watching at the circuit or at home, and I think the sprints shouldn't be taking away from that. So the sprints are something else that we can discuss in another episode when we're sort of between races, when there's not been a race or there's not one coming up or something like that. We're in a sort of in-between week. But generally speaking, I think that the idea of then limiting that practice time, I think that's a good thing. I also think that a rule change for this year has been a good thing for the teams, but maybe robbed us of a little bit more drama on the Sunday. Because for those who don't know, Formula One, you have this system called parc fermé. It's literally closed park in French. And that is essentially the ruling that after the car leaves the garage at the beginning of qualifying, that's it as far as the setup is concerned. You are not allowed to change the setup of the car anymore. And, of course, there are some subtle things that can be changed, things like the angle of the front wing. The driver can change things on board, like the differential and the brake bias and things like that. But generally speaking, all the main setup points, things like the stiffness of your suspension, the geometry that is set up in terms of the angles of the camber and the toe of the tyre, the rear wing setup, the actual parts on the car as well. So you're not allowed to swap out parts unless they are of the exact same specification as the part you've just taken off. things like that. That is that's all to be, that's all locked away. You can't touch that anymore. And in previous years, when we had the sprints, that was also the case, is that you would leave the garage at the beginning of qualifying or sprint qualifying, whichever would come first. They've changed the format of the sprint so many times, honestly, I forget. But you would leave the garage at the beginning of the first session after practice, essentially, and then the car would be locked in. Now, if that were the case for the Grand Prix, we could have potentially had a very, very interesting Grand Prix on our hands, because clearly there were some teams that had gotten it more right than others, shall we say. I wouldn't go so far as to say teams got it wrong, but I think there were teams that were able to hit a sort of a higher peak of performance in their sprint cars relative to others who then, with all the learning from the sprint, they were able to then change that, because this is the thing going on to the new rule for this year, is that Parc Fermé is now lifted in between the sprint and qualifying. So you can then change the setup of the cars. It then closes again as soon as the car leaves the garage for main qualifying. And for anybody not keeping up so far, the usual format in a Formula One race weekend is that we have 3 practice sessions, then qualifying to determine the grid for the Grand Prix, and then the Grand Prix itself. So you have those 3 distinct types of event, shall we say, that happen over the course of the weekend. With the sprint weekend, this year at least, it is 1 practice session, then you have qualifying for the sprint, then you have the sprint itself, then you have qualifying for the Grand Prix, and then you have the Grand Prix itself. And it is in between the sprint and qualifying. That is then where Parc Fermé is broken, and then of course you leave the garage at the beginning of qualifying. That's when Parc Fermé closes again. So these things then allow the teams to be able to get any sort of weaknesses in the car dialed out with all the data that they'll have gathered. Because this is the thing, is that over the course of a usual Grand Prix weekend, you'll be looking at the cars running something in the region of about 300 plus sensors on board during the Friday running. So practice 1 and practice 2. Then on practice 3, they'll have gutted out most of those sensors because they won't want the additional weight on board. You'll be down to about 100, maybe, something in that region. And then at that point, you're then running that car as is until the end of the race weekend, in terms of the number of sensors on board and everything else. But it means that you're gathering terabytes worth of data off of the cars in just sort of raw text data as well. We're not talking about, a 4K raw video file. But it's, a huge amount of data is coming off of these cars. It's then all being processed back at the factory and in the garages and everything else, and then they're determining how best to set up the car. Now, it's simple maths, right? If you have 3 sessions with 2 of those 3 having 300 sensors on board, 1 having 100 sensors on board, then you're going to gather an enormous amount of data, and you should therefore be able to set the car up almost perfectly. If, however, you have 1 practice session and later that day you then have sprint qualifying, you've got a choice. Either you can run the car with 300 sensors in practice, and then you likely won't have enough time to be able to remove 200 sensors prior to sprint qualifying, so you'll then be running a slightly heavier car throughout sprint qualifying and the sprint itself. But then, of course, between the sprint and qualifying, you might then have enough time to be able to gut those sensors out before qualifying, and so on. Or you're going to run just 100 sensors in practice, and then you've got that's all of your data. That's it. So that's where we can see teams maybe getting it right, getting it wrong, or less right, shall we say, in terms of setup for the sprint. We saw that then with a rain-affected sprint qualifying as well. We were then seeing some cars not stepping up to the plate in the way we would usually expect them to, in particular Red Bull. It's the first time they've started it outside the top 3 for a Formula One sprint in the format's history. With Verstappen starting in 4th and Perez starting even lower down. Your top 3 were Lando Norris after a little bit of jeopardy in terms of the interpretation of the rules as far as, going over the white lines of the circuit, whether that removes just 1 lap time or 2 lap times. Yes, no, remove both, no, reinstate the second one. It was a whole thing that ended up happening there. But eventually he did end up getting his time reinstated. He took the sprint pole. You then had Lewis Hamilton in 2nd place, and then you had Fernando Alonso in 3rd. Now you look to then those last 2 drivers in particular, their teammates, they were then miles away. They were so far away from where those other 2 drivers ended up. Now, in the case of Hamilton and Russell, that's quite surprising, and you would imagine that there's probably been 2 very different setup directions that have been gone in those cars for the sprint, or maybe just that Hamilton had the better go of it in the wet conditions. He is, of course, a rainmeister within Formula One, amongst various other drivers. I mean, it's the drivers in the top four are the ones that you would expect to see at the top end of a session that is affected by rain. You've got Norris, you've got Alonso, you've got Hamilton, and you've got Verstappen. You've got the two most experienced drivers in the field in Alonso and Hamilton, and then you've got Verstappen and Norris, who are regarded by many, myself included, as being some of the best wet weather drivers that we've got on the grid currently. But then you look down the rest of the order and it is a little bit then more jumbled. And so, when you've got less data, when things are less precise, that's then where the driver can make a bit more of a difference. And that's where we then start to see, the grid not being like a Noah's Ark. It's not a 2x2x2x2, which, sometimes we get, sometimes we don't. Sometimes, though, it's most of the time, I should say, it's pretty clear that right now in the sport, in a normal qualifying session, if you are not driving a Red Bull, a Ferrari, a McLaren, an Aston or a Mercedes, you're probably not getting into Q3, i.e. the top 10 in qualifying. Now, if you are driving one of those cars, there is one of those cars that is not necessarily guaranteed a spot in Q3, and that is the Aston Martin of Lance Stroll. More on him later on. But generally speaking, that's then the understanding is if you can beat Stroll, then you can maybe get a point if you're one of the lower teams. So that's then where the big competition is right now in Formula One, I think. It's that fight between those bottom 5 teams versus the top 5 teams, and not necessarily their fight with each group, but more the, how well do the bottom 5 fight with one another, and who comes out on top of that group to then be able to maybe sneak themselves a point or two if there is drama and if there are problems for those cars further ahead. And I've seen some criticism of this and of the current point system and things like that. There's now also a potential new point system being debated within the FIA to reward points down to 12th place. And I think it's a bit silly, to be honest with you. I think that I'm very much in the Martin Brundle camp of things, in that F1 World Championship points are something that should be hard fought for and well deserved. There should not be a thank you for turning up prize. So, it's one of these things. I mean, obviously, there are some people who are then going a bit further than that and suggesting that, it will affect the what am I trying to say here? It will affect the record books if you end up awarding points for even more places. And that I kind of just say, well, that's a load of twaddle. I mean, yes, it will affect the record books, but the record books have already been affected. The fact that we no longer have 7 races a season, for example, means that we can no longer fairly compare the drivers of today versus the drivers of, say, 1950. The fact that the cars now produce so much more speed and so much more downforce and everything else that they have done in times gone by, well, that's also another thing that then puts it in a completely different world compared to the cars of yesteryear. The point system has already been overhauled many, many times in the championship's history, and yet we still have drivers with X amount of points in their career as, they're the most points of any driver in history. But if you actually went back, then used an older point system for all of their various different race results and finishes, then they probably wouldn't have quite as many points. And things like that. You've also got things like the number of Grand Prix entered. People like Rubens Barrichello, you've got Fernando Alonso now as well, Kimi Raikkonen, these drivers with the big long careers, many, many races under their belt. Again, there are more races in a season, so yes, you're going to get more drivers now getting up towards those top-end figures in terms of number of Grand Prix competed in. So the record books are an ever-flowing and ever-changing thing. I don't care about the record books. What I care about is the effort that is put in to get those points. And fundamentally, if you are not one of the top 5 teams, then you need to do better. You shouldn't just be given points because, you turned up, so well done you. You should be getting points because you innovated, you worked hard, you designed good parts, you manufactured them on time or even ahead of time, you delivered them to the car and they delivered the performance that was expected, or possibly even more than was expected. That's how you should be getting points in Formula One. And so anybody who bemoans the top 5 for locking out the top 10 positions, frankly, that's not their problem. It's the problem of the teams behind who need to do a better job to unseat them. And yes, it's not an equal playing field. There is a cost cap in Formula One these days, of course, as we know, which does in theory level the playing field in some ways, but we already know now that there are ways in which teams are getting around that. There are teams and organisations who have additional companies who, under their umbrella, who are able to essentially say you are a part-time Formula One worker and therefore only your part-time salary counts towards the budget cap, even if they're actually putting a lot more hours into Formula One than is officially reported. Now, that loophole is going to be closed up in the near future, either with the new Concord Agreement or in the next year or two, or whatever it happens to be, because then you'll get the new financial rules, and that has already been discussed by the FIA. They are going to close that loophole up. Essentially, if you work in Formula One, whether you are officially contracted to do 1 hour there and then another 39 hours a week in an automotive arm of a company, for example, then doesn't matter, your entire salary, including all the automotive arm stuff, that all counts towards the F1 budget cap. And I think that's a good thing. That, again, closes the field up more. It closes those loopholes down because ultimately some of those smaller teams don't have additional auxiliary companies to be able to fund, or not fund, but to obfuscate the funding of their engineers and designers and everything else. But as well as that, it's also then ideas of infrastructure and what technology is available to you, because Formula One is a technologically driven sport, is a data-driven sport. And so if you have, say, a new advanced wind tunnel or simulator or CFD program or blah, 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 this, that, and the other, essentially then it means that you are getting yourself into a position where you are going to be at a natural advantage. You've got good tools. You, of course, need the talent and the people to be able to work those tools to get the good results from them. If you were to give, say, the most advanced equipment in all of Formula One to somebody who had, I'm going to offend some people here, but you'll see my point. But if you were to give them to somebody who has a BTEC in French, for example, then, they're not going to be able to do very much with those tools compared to somebody working with, a doctorate in aerodynamic design with some outdated tools. The person who, if you gave Adrian Newey, for example, a ancient old bunch of kit, stuff that it would have been old even in his day when he first started working in Formula One in the 1980s, then he would still probably do an awful lot better than somebody who didn't actually have the qualifications and the understanding and the knowledge and everything else. So technology is important, but you need the talent in which to do that. So yeah, it's an interesting position in which we find ourselves. I also think there may be something looming on the horizon as far as a potential cost cap issue in the future. Because in order to deal with the differing costs of living in Switzerland versus the UK, of course, vast majority of Formula One teams are based in the UK, but Sauber, soon to be Audi in a couple of years, is based in Switzerland. And of course, massive differences in cost of living in terms of wages, of minimum wage, and then the entry requirements to get into Switzerland as far as how much money you need to be earning and things like that. It then means that Sauber are having an increase to their budget cap, just theirs. But I can see a scenario in which they then have an increase in their budget cap, but then they start to hire people who work remotely in other parts of the world who they can pay less. And then as a result of that, they're able to get more personnel and more everything else. That is a scenario I envision. Now, whether or not that has then been accounted for in the rules and in terms of how they've been amended, I don't know. But certainly, I hope that somebody in the FIA listens to this and is able to then close off that particular loophole for the future. So that's that. Now, we have already, in all of that ranting, gone through about 18 minutes of our time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to focus now on a few team-specific stories, really, up and down the grid of the Chinese Grand Prix. And then, if we've got the time for it, we'll look forwards to what is coming in Miami. So first of all, we've got Red Bull. And Red Bull really is I think it's the beginning of the end for Sergio Perez. It's a pretty bold claim to be making, I know. It's pretty extreme given how well he's been performing so far this year. But let's break it down. You've got Max Verstappen, who in every single lap of the Chinese Grand Prix set a faster lap time than everyone who finished in second, third and fourth. Every single lap, you compare them, he's done a quicker lap. With the exception of laps where he's gone into the pits and others have not. But those taken to one side, he did a faster lap time in every single Grand Prix. Now, that is information that comes courtesy of Kurun Chandok's Twitter, So if that is incorrect, do not blame me. I'm simply the messenger and I am parroting fake news. If not, then that is mightily impressive by Max Verstappen, and it is a testament to the good job that Red Bull have done in building that car. Albeit, that comes with all the caveats that we have been talking about so far this season, in that they were so far ahead last year because Mercedes Ferrari didn't push them enough that they were able to end development on that car early. It still went on to dominate the championship, and then with that early end development, they could then have an early start to the design of this year's car, and that is what perpetuates the cycle of dominance within Formula One. But it is an aero formula, so in theory they can be caught. Now, when it comes to the other car, with Sergio Perez, the reason why I think this is the beginning of the end for him in Red Bull is that it's his job to come second when Verstappen wins. When Verstappen doesn't win, it's his job to win. And he has the car to be able to do that. He has the car which is capable of making that sort of achievement, week in, week out. And yet despite that, yes, he has had a number of 1-2s with Verstappen over the course of this year, though keen to point out, none of them have been with Perez as the driver finishing in first. He's always been in second. But earlier on this year, of course, we had the Australian Grand Prix. We had Max Verstappen with a brake failure in the first couple of laps, and then that led the rest of the field to then fight out for the victory. And we ended up seeing a Ferrari 1-2 with a McLaren in third at Australia. That already, for me, didn't bode well as far as potential for Perez was concerned. You then come to this weekend where Verstappen does not end up going out of the race. Perez was the very good beneficiary of some excellent double stacking pit stops from Red Bull, and I must say, if anybody from Red Bull ever does listen to this podcast, hats off to anybody who listens in the pit crew, because that was fabulous. That was absolutely brilliant. To be able to see two stops back-to-back that were 2.0, 2.1 seconds, and then a 1.9 and a 2.1. Absolutely brilliant. Really, really good performance from Red Bull there. But despite all of that, despite all of these things going for him, Perez still managed to finish in third place, behind Lando Norris. And Norris was in a McLaren, which McLaren themselves thought, actually going into this weekend, we're not going to do well. We are going to be in a position where we're going to be facing all the things that this car does not like. And for those of you not aware, McLaren have essentially been saying all year long that the deficits in their car are corners in which the steering lock has to be applied for a long period of time. You've got a couple of very long sweeping corners in China, in particular 7 and 8. Big long left, big long right, where you've got a sustained steering lock being applied. Another area where their car has not been great so far this year is on the straights. They've not had great top-end speed, and in particular they have been saying that their DRS system, I hate when people say that actually, DRS, drag reduction system, so I've essentially said drag reduction system. But the DRS then on the McLaren is not as efficient as its rivals, is what they've been saying. So that's that. You've then also got the additional issue, which is that the cars, it doesn't perform well in slow speed corners. Now, admittedly, there are not too many of those around the Shanghai circuit, but where there are, they're quite significant. You've got the whole complex of turns 1, 2, 3, for example, where it's, you could look at it and say that's one corner then going into a second corner, but technically it's more than one. It's complicated, but it's a great big long apex. It's a combination of two things, really. It's a very slow speed corner, and it's also one in which you're staying with sustained steering lock for a long, long time. And so these things then should mean that McLaren didn't do well in that part of the circuit, yet consistently they were actually among the fastest, if not the fastest, in that first sector, particularly in qualifying and sprint qualifying. So that was an interesting thing to observe. But then, ultimately, it is a McLaren in 2024. It is a car that has been third best throughout the whole season, with Ferrari usually in second place, and then Red Bull, of course, always at the top. Now, when we then take a look at Perez's performance, and we think about that fact that he finished in third place and not in second, to a car that is usually third, but this weekend you would say was definitely second quickest. Okay, well, we can give him a little bit more leeway for that. But we go back to that point about Verstappen. Verstappen set a lap time quicker than Norris every single lap. So why can't Perez? Because the fact of the matter was, Perez wasn't matching Norris's times. He was slower than Norris. The only exception that I can recall in which he actually gained time on Norris throughout that sort of final stint of the race was the lap when Norris made a mistake locking up one of the tyres and lost about a second as a result of that mistake. But even then, Norris had built up such a gap that he was then still several seconds ahead of Perez and could then just get himself back into the rhythm and then extend his gap out once again. And, these things all told, all combined, this then is what ultimately brings me to the point that Perez is going to start struggling again. As Red Bull bring more upgrades to the car, which make it more peaky, more difficult to drive, he's going to struggle. Max is going to continue to do well. As other teams bring performance to their cars and start to close that gap up to Red Bull, we've heard, for example, from McLaren, from Andrea Stella, they believe that they will be fighting for victories come the end of the season with the trajectory that their upgrade path is on. Ferrari have been pretty bullish since the start of the season that they feel they can fight on certain circuits throughout the year. They feel that Monza is going to be another strong showing for them as it was last year, and various others. If that ends up happening, if we end up having more reliability issues for Max Verstappen's Red Bull, where's Sergio Perez going to be? Because he's not going to be winning those races. He's not going to be on the podium in some of those races. And that is going to leave Red Bull Racing with a potential problem because, of course, if these teams chasing Red Bull continue to just gather up the performance, they continue to get closer, they're able to start beating them on merit, that means that come next year, they will probably be able to beat Red Bull on merit as much, if not more than, this year. Because again, stable regulation and cycle, it closes the field up. When that ends up happening, is Perez going to cost them a world championship, like he did in 2021? Because, of course, Max Verstappen, world champion in 2021, albeit in controversial circumstances, but he was world champion. Mercedes-Benz were the Constructors' champions, not Red Bull Racing. And so when he starts to cost them a whole championship, when he starts to cost the staff their bonuses and their salaries, when he potentially can't then act as the second runner, the backup gunner for Max Verstappen, where maybe Verstappen is being hounded by 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe, cars from behind, well, all of a sudden then Perez has outlived his usefulness at Red Bull. And at this point in the season, yes, you can point to all those good results he's had so far, but they're not the same peak that he reached this time last year. He's not been able to do any race wins. He's not looked at all convincing versus Verstappen, except for outside of a couple of qualifying performances, but then the race, Verstappen always drives away from him. I think that Perez could be in trouble, especially with Carlos Sainz on the driver market for next year. I would not be surprised if we have a reunion of the 2015 Toro Rosso lineup in Red Bull Racing next year. And I think that Sergio Perez could be in a whole lot of trouble later on this season, but we will wait and see on that one. So that's a bit about Red Bull. That's a bit about McLaren as well, kind of touching on those ideas that car has been performing better than they expected at that particular circuit. Some of that has been put down to the resurfacing of the track. It was, weirdly enough, it was painted in parts of the circuit, which then, of course, gives a very, very low grip surface in parts of the track, especially when it started to rain. And the McLaren seem to do really, really well on low grip surfaces. They've since come out and they've been talking about some of the weaknesses of the car this year. They talk about how their upgrade for Miami is, of course, performance related and can be adding performance to the car, but there's also going to be a great deal of focus on that upgrade is on tyre management. Because in qualifying, that car can get the tyres switched on and can out-qualify Ferrari. They can do very, very good job there. They could even out-qualify Perez's Red Bull. But, and in the case of sprint qualifying for Norris this weekend, they can put it on pole as well. But they end up then leaning on the tyres too much in the race. And this was a trait that we saw of McLaren last year as well. It was something that was particularly noticeable in the first part of the year before they got their Austria upgrade, but then even after the Austria upgrade, it was then something which occasionally reared its head. It's just so often they happen to have such a performance advantage over the rest of the chasing pack, that wasn't really all too noticeable. It was not really until the last few races of the year when Ferrari seemed to get their act together and then became the second quickest car once again. But for the majority of that second half of the season, it was McLaren with the second quickest car. And so if they're able to, focusing back on this year, get themselves into a position where they can manage those tyres far more effectively in the race, yet still retain the ability to fire them up and use them effectively in qualifying, then that McLaren could become significantly quicker over a race distance, even if they added no performance to the car. But of course, if they are adding performance to the car, this could see McLaren move into a definitive, if I get all of my superlatives and adjectives right, second place in the pecking order, at least until Imola. That's when Ferrari are bringing a big upgrade for their car. That could then potentially flip the competitive order once again, but we'll wait and see. So McLaren, I think, an interesting one to look at over the course of this race weekend. Of course, very unfortunate for Oscar Piastri to be caught up in the fracas that happened between Stroll and Ricciardo. More on that later. But he was looking pretty good up until that point. He was just shuffled out a little bit by timing of safety cars and things like that, but he had then good tyres on, he had a good pace, good strategy, and he was managing those tyres well. That's something which I've been impressed by Piastri this year, is his improvement in tyre management over the course of a race and over the course of a stint. Now, of course, he's still nowhere near the level of Norris. Norris is far more experienced with these tyres, with Pirelli and Formula One and things like that, so he's got greater understanding of these things. Piastri is still learning. He's in his second year, don't forget. So anybody who thinks that he's going to be on the same level as a driver who's been in the sport for now 5 years, in the case of Norris, then they're wishing a bit too much, I think. But he's still able to put in some great qualifying laps. He's still able to put in some good race results. I think that more podiums for him later on this season are almost assured. But we will, of course, have to wait and see. When it comes to Ferrari had a bit of an odd race this race, in that I think actually the thing we need to talk about the most with Ferrari in the Chinese Grand Prix was actually more to do with their intra-team battle, because the gloves kind of came off a little bit this weekend, and I think that is down to a number of external factors. And it's to do with the sacking of Carlos Sainz, the fact that he has been thrown to the wind by Ferrari for next season in favour of Lewis Hamilton. Frankly, of all the drivers on the grid that you were going to replace Sainz with, it made the most sense that it be Hamilton. I think outside of Hamilton, Alonso, Verstappen, possibly Norris, if you were ever to want to leave McLaren and go to Ferrari, I don't think there would be anybody else on the grid that you would kick Sainz out for. And so Sainz then, in the position that he's in, is, of course, trying to build up his stock. He's trying to show all the other teams on the grid that he is the one that they want and the one they should put their faith in and sign for many, many moolah in terms of the dollars on his paycheck. But as far as all of that is concerned, he's been doing a great job of it so far this season. This is the first race all year that he took part in, bearing in mind he didn't take part in Saudi Arabia because of his appendicitis. It was the first time that he was not on the podium in a race that he'd taken part in. And of course, he's the only driver, not Max Verstappen, to win a race so far this year as well. So he's been doing a great job versus Charles Leclerc. And Leclerc knows this. Leclerc knows he's not going anywhere for next season, but if he gets mentally demolished by being beaten by Sainz all year long, then when he then gets a motivated, excited Lewis Hamilton in next door at Ferrari next season, Leclerc could be in real trouble from a mental perspective and therefore from a performance perspective, because as we all know, the mentality of athletes, particularly in Formula One, is so important. You ever want to have a greater insight into that, I would very much recommend that you check out a Sky Sports interview held with Alain Prost when it came to discussing the topic of his late great rival Ayrton Senna. He goes on to talk about how psychology is an incredibly important factor in a racing driver, how sometimes in that period of 88 and 89, when he was teammates with Senna, there'd be an engine that would turn up. Two engines, of course, one for his car and one for Senna's. And on Senna's car, there'd be a little badge on it saying special for Ayrton. And even though the engines were the exact same, save for that little thing, that suddenly creeps into his head. That then lets him know that there is some preference at Honda HQ for Senna and not for Prost. And that then led to the rising tensions in the team. That then led to some of his downturns in performance, some of his upturns in performance, where he wanted to then, of course, fight back against that, and so on. So psychology is incredibly important. So for Leclerc to be constantly beaten by Sainz, something that really hasn't happened to the degree that it has done in this opening few rounds of the season, will be something that is playing on his mind a great deal. Now, the other driver that we've then got to consider here is Charles Leclerc himself. And what were his contributions to why the Ferrari teammates started to then go a bit a bit crazy at each other this weekend. And he, of course, wants to raise his stock. He wants to justify to Ferrari the big, long contract extension he's got there. He wants to, as I say, he wants to make sure he establishes himself as team lead by the time Lewis Hamilton comes in, because Hamilton will make a claim for that pretty shortly after he arrives at the team. It's no mystery that he's going to turn up and then try and essentially take everybody around him and then go forward as the lead driver within the team. It's Lewis Hamilton. He's an incredibly motivated, incredibly talented driver. He's got 7 world championships for a reason. And so, when we have all of this coming to the fore here, we've got 2 drivers who, for 2 differing reasons, want to beat their teammates so much more than the standard fare beat your teammate argument in Formula 1. And so they ended up costing themselves positions, they cost themselves performance. When it came to, the sprint, there was the move done by Sainz on Alonso. Alonso then counterattacked, and then Leclerc tried to go for the move. They tried to get themselves past. And that then slowed the pair of them up. That then allowed another car through, and they ended up then losing position as a result. In the beginning of the Grand Prix, they ended up then losing themselves positions off of the start because they focused so much on fighting one another, they opened up a massive, great big old barn door for the likes of George Russell and Nico Hülkenberg to slide up the inside in turn number 1 and take away their position. So Ferrari, a little bit in the wind in this particular race from a driver's perspective in terms of fighting one another a bit too much. Then when you take into account the actual operation of the team, I saw cracks of the Ferrari of old, really, of the sort of Mattia Binotto and I forget his name now, but the team boss that had previously been in before Binotto during the time of sort of Vettel and Raikkonen, that sort of period of time there. In that Ferrari were not looking particularly smart on strategy this weekend. They or on the radio. Strategy, maybe you could say actually they were fine. I wouldn't say they were great, but they were fine. But on the radio, you listen to some of the radio conversations that were going on, and it just seems as though the race engineers don't know how to communicate with their drivers. Sainz had to request information in terms of how old the tyres were on the cars in front of him during the safety car period or during a period of the race. I forget when exactly it was. And his race engineer came back with vague answers each time. Oh, well, so-and-so's tyres are younger than this driver's. Well, that's not the question he asked. He asked, how old are the tyres on the 3 cars in front of me? And so the question had to be asked 3 times before Sainz got a satisfactory answer, or at least he stopped asking at that point, whether it was satisfactory or not. Then you go to Leclerc, and in the closing stages of the race, his race engineer is telling him to try a different line through one of the corners, but rather than doing so in a precise, succinct way, he just kind of speaks a bit more vaguely and a bit sort of, oh, well, you should do what you did previously. And quite rightly, Leclerc's coming back on the radio going, I don't know what you're talking about. What do you mean? So I think that with Ferrari, the race engineers, I mean, honestly, if Hamilton is able to bring Pete Bonington, his race engineer at Mercedes, over to Ferrari for next year, then Sainz's engineer can kiss his position goodbye. He's not going to be staying. Hamilton will not want to work with him. If you look at all of the communication that's been done between that particular race engineer, and I apologise, I don't know their name off the top of my head. I know that Leclerc's engineer is called Xavi, but I don't know what Sainz's engineer's name is called. But ultimately, the communication between him and Sainz, between him and Vettel before that, it has just been at times, not constantly, but at times poor. And so it's one of these things where they seem to have a very good relationship, both drivers, with this particular race engineer. They seem to have a good time chatting to them when it's not in the height of a race situation and so on. But it's something which, that's a potential flaw in the Ferrari system right now. So that's Ferrari. Mercedes, oh goodness gracious me, Mercedes, they don't understand this car. And it's a continuation of the last couple of years. In the first year of the new regs, they came in with this zero-pod philosophy. They thought they could get it to work, that this was just growing pains for it, but it would come good eventually. They then led themselves down a false route and a false hope in terms of development, because they managed to add so much performance to the car over the course of the year, whilst other teams weren't adding performance to their cars, or certainly not to the same degree, that then they were able to win the Brazilian Grand Prix in 2022 with George Russell. Following that, of course, we then had them believing that that meant that the philosophy was right and that they should stick with it. And so they go into 2023 and the car's still not great. And so they then change concept at Monaco. They try and then shift it towards something else, but they can't quite make wholesale change because, of course, a lot of that is to do with the chassis in the centre of the car, the monocoque. And there are limitations in terms of where certain parts are placed, where things are shaped and so on, because the chassis are homologated. You cannot change them without introducing a new chassis that has to be crash tested, has to be homologated all over again. And so when that all comes to pass, you've then got a real struggle when it comes to Mercedes and their development path at the moment, because right now they don't know what they're doing. Their correlation is not speaking to them, because after they've changed concept over the winter, brought this new car in, it's not doing as they expected. They add parts to the car, it doesn't do what they think, it doesn't do what they expect. In terms of setup direction, they go through a few different directions and they find that it's not doing as intended, or it's inconsistent. And so they are just really in the weeds with this car. Russell is doing a really good job. Hamilton, at a few events so far this season, has been doing a bit of the kind of donkey setup work that he was doing in 2022 to try and sort the car out. But ultimately, it's still not coming to them all that well. And it's strange to look at, frankly, to see a team that had dominated the sport so much in the previous era and the previous rule set to now be struggling so much, to the extent that they're regularly being beaten by their customer teams. And that comes with the caveat, of course, that yes, we're in an engine freeze, so therefore the customers can design the car around a known quantity as far as the engine is concerned. But regardless, they are the works Mercedes team. They are the 8 times Constructors' Champions. They are the 7 times Drivers' Champions throughout the period of 2014 to 2020. And it's just so bizarre to see them have such a fall from grace like this. And I wouldn't be surprised if Aston are able to get their act together a little bit in terms of their car development, add more performance to it as the season goes on. If they can get the correlation on parts and Mercedes can't, then even if Aston is a one-man band with Alonso scoring all the points, I wouldn't be surprised, really, based on Mercedes' form these first few rounds, if they actually end up finishing ahead of them come the end of the year. I think come the end of the year, McLaren are definitely finishing ahead of them, if things persist as they do right now. And that's something which Mercedes should begin to become worried about, because if they start to get beaten by their customers, then at what point does the Daimler board turn around and start going, well, what's the point in us owning an F1 team? We put so much money into this year on year, and yet we're losing now, and we've lost for several years. 2023 they didn't win a single race. Are they going to win a race this year? Press X to doubt. But this is the situation Mercedes just find themselves in right now. They need to figure themselves out. They need to do it quickly. We talk about an awful lot on this podcast about how these things take time. There are big, long lead times in Formula One of months and years for projects to come to fruition. But fundamentally, they need to get a relatively quick understanding as to why the car doesn't do what they tell it to, and then how they can fix it. Because if they don't, they'll spend the entire year doing R&D, and then they'll start to design a car for next year with no idea if they're resolving these problems or not until it hits the track in 2025. Now we come to the next team on the grid, and that's Aston Martin. Oh dear. The Green Team have impressed me this year in some ways. They've got a good car that, in the hands of Fernando Alonso, is able to get some really good performances out of it. It's not quite the renaissance that they had at the beginning of last year, where they were able to go on and get so many podiums and even challenge for the win on a couple of occasions in the early part of the season. And I don't expect that they're going to be challenging for the win anytime soon. But, as I've said already, it's a one-man band over there right now. There is a reason why other teams have scored so far, outside of reliability problems for other top-running cars, like Verstappen in Australia, for example, and that's because Lance Stroll is not doing a good job. And, Stroll at this point, he is a more experienced driver in Formula One than the likes of Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc, even. He's got a 1 year longer career than Charles Leclerc at this stage as Lance Stroll. And despite that, you would look at all of them lined up and you would easily put Stroll at the back. By some margin. He's had flashes of brilliance over his time. Getting a front row start in a rain-soaked qualifying at Monza in 2017. That was great. Getting a pole position in the Racing Point in 2020. That was also fantastic. Very well done. But those flashes are few and far between, and seemingly getting fewer and further between. And more we're seeing more what we would have said in times gone by an uncharacteristic mistake for a Formula One driver, but it's rapidly becoming a characteristic mistake for Lance Stroll. The big flashpoint, of course, in this race in China was the fact that he ended up spearing into the back of Daniel Ricciardo, who in turn went into the back of Oscar Piastri as a result of that contact. And with Stroll, he was immediately on the radio, getting defensive, and arguing that everyone in front of him was brake-checking him and checking up early and all this sort of a thing. But the fact of the matter is, you look at the onboard, and Daniel Ricciardo made the same point in the media pen, and he had identified this immediately after seeing his onboard. Stroll wasn't looking ahead of him. He was looking into the corner that was coming up, because he was expecting to see the front cars start to dart from that point and disappear up the road, so then he could get an early warning of that and then start to disappear off into the distance himself and leave the cars behind him for dead, and maybe even have the opportunity to overtake the cars in front. But in doing so, he's looking at the corner, he's looking to his right, when in front of him there are cars that are slamming on the anchors. And it's been described by some, I think by Jolyon Palmer in F1 TV commentary, by way of it being like a motorway crash. In that there are a bunch of people in a queue, somebody brakes for some reason, and then the velocity of each car and the reaction time of each car behind just means that eventually somebody is going to go into the back of someone else. But the fact of the matter is, you look at the distance between, say, Ricciardo and Piastri. Ricciardo was able to get his car slowed down enough where if he wasn't hit up the back, he wouldn't have touched Piastri. And yet he had a smaller gap between him and Piastri than Stroll did between him and Ricciardo. And, if you really slam on the anchors in a Formula One car, then you're going to see a lockup. Was there a lockup for Lance Stroll? No. And so, it was clumsy. It was stupid. And, Lance Stroll, I'm not saying is a stupid person. I'm not saying that. It can be they don't have to be mutually exclusive, that the person is not stupid or is not talentless and also does something really stupid in the middle of a race. And the fact of the matter is, though, that as far as his racing brain is concerned, Lance Stroll clearly is losing it. Because, yes, he has had success in junior formulae. He has won championships up against other drivers in the F1 field, like Esteban Ocon and others. But past performance is no indicator of future success. You can't turn around and say, well, we won all of this, so therefore we're going to win for forevermore. Well, tell that to McLaren. In the 80s, between 84 and then into 91, they only lost one drivers' championship in that entire period of time. And yet, where have they been for the last decade at McLaren? Lounging in the midfield for the majority of it, even towards the back end of the midfield during some of those years. And then only in recent times, well, they got one Grand Prix win in 2021, stopped their win drought going on as far as 10 years, and then they got a sprint win last year. Arguably, could have been in position to win a Grand Prix as well, on one or maybe two occasions. But, all of that comes from the same team, even some people still working there since that golden age of winning in the 1980s. You go a bit more recently, Ferrari won 5 titles on the trot with Michael Schumacher, and they even won 6 titles on the trot when it came to the Constructors, winning the Constructors in 1999, and then, of course, all the way through until 2004. And so, where have they been since their last championship in 2008, where they won the Constructors? Nowhere. They've not been winning championships at all in that period of time. They've won races, but they've also had dud seasons. They've had times where they've not had a particularly good car. 2014, 2016 come to mind, 2020 as well, and 2021, or part of that season at least. Those cars were not great. 2020, they didn't win a race, for example. And so, Ferrari then, being in that position, not particularly impressive. But, of course, they are making strides. They're making that move forward to try and get themselves back to a championship-winning place. And they're certainly looking a lot closer to it than we're seeing with Lance Stroll getting anywhere near winning a race in Formula One or winning a championship in Formula One, because that's ultimately what Aston Martin is. Aston Martin is a project by Lawrence Stroll to create, as he says, the greatest Formula One team in the world. But if he wants to do that, he needs to get rid of his son. Because they could make a fantastic car, but unless it has an even larger margin of performance than the Red Bull does right now or last year over the rest of the field, Lance isn't going to be winning anything. He's going to be coming second to Fernando Alonso at best, or he's going to be coming in lower down positions because he'll be being beaten by other cars that are slower than his car. Or he'll be making mistakes and silly decisions in a race that then cause him to crash out, or have a compromised strategy because he's got a pit at the end of the first lap, or etc., etc. And I think that Ricciardo's reaction was entirely justified. Ricciardo was having a great race in China prior to that contact. I mean, I think the contact does obfuscate slightly the really poor strategy decisions that that VCARB had been making over the course of that Grand Prix. And so I think that in the fullness of time, had that crash not occurred, I don't think Ricciardo would have finished in the points. I think it would have been a very strong performance worthy of points, but I think that he ultimately would have finished maybe in the mid-teens, maybe the top end of the teens possibly, in terms of position, because ultimately he would have had to go back into the pits again on a strange pit strategy that VCARB put him on, and then ultimately, find himself in a tricky position. So Ricciardo then understandably upset, and I think that the other thing that really irks me with the Stroll thing is that we put to one side all of the background to it, in that his dad has bought him the seat essentially, and his father owns the team, so therefore he's not going anywhere until he decides he wants to stop being a Formula One driver, and so on and so forth, and on and on and on we go. And, I sit there and I think to myself, it's such a, it's just such a shame. It's just so frustrating to see a driver taking up that spot and then being absolutely adamant in their opinion it was not their fault. You go into the back of someone on a motorway in an incident like that, regardless of the fact that there's been however many cars in front of you all braking, therefore reducing your potential reaction time, you're still the one at fault as far as an insurer is concerned. And so in the same way, he was still at fault as far as the stewards were concerned. They gave him a 10-second time penalty. Now, I'm a fan of the 10-second time penalties coming in, as opposed to the 5 seconds that we've had in times gone by. I think 10 seconds is far more punishing for when you have a big incident like that. And I know that we shouldn't be judging things based on the outcome, we should be judging them based on the action, but let's be honest, even just based on the action, it was a clumsy, stupid thing to be doing. But ultimately, it's just such a painful thing. And I actually want to, I don't like the idea of doing this, and I certainly don't want to be making a habit of it, but I want to raise a point in comparison to another podcast. And that's a podcast that I listen to a lot of the time, and I actually really enjoy. But there was this one particular moment in a recent episode that irked me to no end. And that's the Formula for Success podcast. That's the podcast that's hosted by David Coulthard and Eddie Jordan. Now, David Coulthard, full disclosure here, David Coulthard, one of my heroes, one of my top 4 drivers of all time. Not necessarily in terms of performance, because of course he never won a championship or anything like that. And if DC ever happens to listen to me saying that, I apologise profusely, sir. But ultimately, he's one of my drivers. He's the reason why I watched Formula One in 2001. It's the reason why his car from 2001 is one of my favourite cars of all time, because it came second in the championship with him at the wheel. Things like that. So I have a great deal of respect and admiration for him. I also have a great deal of respect and admiration for Eddie Jordan, albeit, he never won a championship either with his team, and towards the end it was a bit of a shambles, and he was always a bit of a wheeler-dealer, sort of, make the deals here and there. But he said something, Eddie Jordan that is, said something on their podcast recently that really upset me. And he was saying that it's not the fault of Fernando Alonso, but the fact that he is still in the car at the age of 42 and he's the blah, 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 blah. And, it's a bad thing for Formula One that these cars are now so easy to drive that someone of his age can drive them, and, he can go ahead and take away the opportunity for young drivers to get into Formula One. And I'm sorry, but it's just a load of rubbish. You've got yes, an older, experienced driver like Fernando Alonso in the car, but fundamentally the cars are not easier to drive than they were 10, 20 years ago. They are more difficult to drive. The steering wheels have over 40 button switches and dials on them with an LCD screen in as well that communicates to the driver massive amounts of data and information over the course of the race that they've got to look down away from the track to be able to ingest that information and digest it as well. In addition to that, the steering wheel then changes over 600 parameters of car performance at the driver's fingertips that are not allowed to be changed remotely by the pit wall, because the driver, according to the regulations, must drive the car alone and unaided. In addition to that, there are getting up to cornering speeds that are the highest that the sport has ever seen, or certainly close to. The cars of 2020, of course, are probably the quickest cars that Formula One has ever had, and that's in part owing to the nature of these regulations, the fact that the cars are much heavier than they were in 2020, but I'm getting sidetracked here. When it comes to these cars, they are objectively much more difficult to drive. Now, the fact that Fernando Alonso is able to drive them is a combination of the fact that Alonso is Alonso. He is one of the greatest drivers of all time, and you can disagree with me on that as much as you like, anybody in any corner of the internet who does, and I would love to hear your justification for it. Email us, raceoclockpodcast@gmail.com. Little plug. But as far as that's concerned, he is one of the most impressive drivers that Formula One has ever seen. He is also someone who has worked on his fitness constantly throughout his 20-plus year Formula One career. And sports science and science of performance and all these things have come on leaps and bounds in the times since Eddie Jordan was running a Formula One team. When you then also take into account that he's targeting Alonso in because of his age. And Alonso's age shouldn't be the factor. It's like so many things in the world right now where people say, oh, well, we should have this for reasons X, Y, Z, that are not to do with the fundamental thing, and that is the performance and what is best for the situation. If you had a driver who was able to get 99% out of the car and was young, or you had a driver who could get 100% out of the car and was older, well, I'd be going for the older driver, because it's performance, it's objective performance. And if you get 100% performance out of the car, then that is maximising, that's getting more out of it. And it doesn't matter who's driving the thing. And ultimately, if you're going to pick on people and you're going to say that it's not right that Formula One has these seats being taken up, you should be looking to the next door driver. You should be looking to Lance Stroll. You should be looking to him and saying, well, he's been in the sport since 2017. He's got a pole. He's got a couple of podiums here and there. But that's it. That's the sum total of his achievements. And when you look at those achievements in contrast to what other drivers in the same car have done in that time, well, when he got his pole position in 2020, guess who managed to win in the same car? Sergio Perez. When he managed to get on the front row in 2017, 2017, that's fair. His teammate was an aged, already mentally retired Felipe Massa. So not exactly the most impressive of teammates. Last year, didn't get a single podium, did Lance Stroll. How many did Alonso get? I think 8 in the end. I could be wrong. But it was just, the guy does not perform. And where in Formula One the adage is that you must beat your teammate, that is the first thing. How often has he done that in his career? Not very. Not very at all. And so ultimately, if anybody in Aston Martin should be the target of Eddie Jordan's ire and saying this person should be getting out of the car, it should be Lance Stroll. As well as that, you've then got the other drivers up and down the grid who frankly are not up to scratch. They're not performing at the level that they should. Logan Sargent, for example. Why on earth did he get an extension for this year? I'll tell you why. It'll be because of money and sponsorship potential in having a US driver in the car. The problem with that line of logic is that Americans do not just support somebody because they're American. Sometimes they will, and sometimes they have a greater appreciation for somebody because they're American. And that's natural for any nation in the world because you want to support your home favourite. You look at the Chinese Grand Prix that we've just had, and Zhou Guanyu finished outside the points. Despite that, all the fans loved him, adored him over the course of that race weekend. And supported him and his Sauber team wholesale. And, so it's natural for there to be a bit of fervour, a bit of nationalistic fervour for a driver of the same country as you. But Americans don't just blindly support an American, especially if they're doing badly. Americans like to support winners. They like to support winners no matter where they're from. You look at IndyCar, for example, you've got people like Tony Kanaan, Brazilian driver. You've got, oh dear, and I'm going to forget his name, but I think it's Scott Dixon, who I believe is a Kiwi, maybe? I know that there is certainly a leading driver in IndyCar who is from New Zealand, and again, the American public adore him. When Alonso went over to Indy to try his hand at the Indy 500, the Americans fell in love with him, and he's Spanish. Americans do not necessarily follow somebody just because of their nationality. They follow somebody because they're able to bring performance, they're able to bring flair, they're able to bring personality to what they're doing. And when it comes to Logan Sargent and any potential sponsorship benefit that might come from the US market, it's not there because Williams don't have a car that's good enough to attract the attention of American fans, and their other driver does significantly better than Logan Sargent does. And that fundamentally is the issue. If you want to get young drivers into Formula One, then you bin off those two, and I would say you actually bin off Zhou Guan Yu as well. He's a lovely lad, and he's got a great personality about him, and he's got his head on properly, I think it's fair to say. And I've got a little bias towards him because he's raced in some races that I've commentated on in the esports scene. But if you look at his performances over the years that he's been in Formula One, has he been massively impressive? No. Did he win the F2 championship on his way to getting into Formula One? No. How did he get in? Sponsorship. Okay. So, now that we're in a budget cap era and Audi owns that team, do they need money coming in from drivers? I don't think so. So there you go. There's 3 seats that can immediately be opened up for young drivers. And I think that, Eddie Jordan needs to take that view rather than just simply bashing on Fernando Alonso because he's old. So that's that. As far as then any other teams are concerned, well, we don't have any time because we've just now ticked down, and that is 1 hour. That was a bit more rambly and ranty than I was expecting, but there we go. We're getting the rust off. Next episode 8, we'll be back to fighting fit. So just wrapping up the podcast here then, I know that there has been a great deal of support for the podcast so far, and I'm led to understand through speaking to some people that there might be some new people listening in this week. So if you are new and you've made it all the way to the end here, then thank you very much for listening. If you're not new and you've made it to the end, also thank you for listening. I appreciate it very much. If you have any questions, we usually do a Q&A in the podcast with sort of audience questions. Then fire them in. Either tweet them to us at RacerClockPod or on our Instagram feed at RacerClockPod. Or, as mentioned earlier on, you can email us racerclockpodcast@gmail.com. For those of you who also have Discord, that application, then go ahead and look in the description of this episode on whichever platform you happen to be listening on, and there should be a link to our Discord server in there. And then there is a special section in there, questions for the podcast, which you can then type in whatever questions you fancy for the podcast itself. In the near future, I'm also going to be getting some interviews lined up with various different contributors from the world of motorsport, from road car, supercar development, from Formula One itself, from journalist perspective, from team perspective, from all sorts of things. We're getting all of these conversations sorted out in the background. We're going to get a lot of them all booked in and done in one big sort of block. So if you've got questions for a guest, that are maybe generic questions, or if I'm able to announce a guest that I'm going to do a recording with, then of course send them in as well. If you have enjoyed the episode, you want to support us a little bit as well, there is also a link on the All My Links page that is again in the description of the episodes here to a Buy Me a Coffee page, and that there you can support the podcast as little or as much as you like from a monetary point of view. But as far as that's concerned, we've got Miami coming up as the next race, of course. I'm looking forward to seeing that. I'm looking forward to talking to you all about it as well, and we will see you there next time. But for the time being then, if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you're on any other platform, hit follow, and we will grace your inbox in the not too distant future. I've been Daniel Gilligan. Thank you very much for listening to the Race O'Clock podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night.